I was really pleased to be invited to Armenia because after 35 years of working in the United Kingdom prison service, before I retired, I felt it was important to be able to give back some of the knowledge, experience and expertise that I'd gained over those years. And when I came to Armenia, I was pleased to be able to visit some prisons in Armenia. I felt like I was going home. Prison life seems to have been my life for the last 35 years. And I said that to the people in the establishments that I went to, that I felt like I was coming home. And it was interesting to notice the difference between what I'd experienced in the United Kingdom and what I was experiencing in Armenia. I also have met with the Deputy Minister of Justice, who outlined the sorts of things that he wanted me to look at, and I did. He wanted me to consider lots of ways that the Armenian prison service may be able to reform itself. So I looked at what I was seeing in the prisons with that in mind. I've also met with senior members of the penitentiary department. I've met with the general public, and I've also met with students and representatives of NGOs that were particularly concerned with the work that goes on in prisons. So I've tried, in the context of what I've learned over the last 35 years, to put together some key factors that I feel are important when considering prisons and how best to run prisons. The basis of any human incarceration is primarily as a punishment. Clearly, when the laws of society are contravened to such an extent that it requires imprisonment, that's a very serious challenge for the individual who's sent to prison, but also a significant challenge for the authority who have to look after them whilst they're in prison. And the authority does have a responsibility, not just as a judicial element, in other words, not just to keep them locked up for as long as the court has said that they should be locked up, but also to look to see what it is that has caused that person to become an offender, and look to ways to try and overcome those difficulties, so that when the person is eventually released, whether that's after a short time or after a very long time, they at least have some opportunity to be rehabilitated and to manage in society. I said last night during a lecture that it isn't a prisoner who does well in prison that succeeds, it's a prisoner that is equipped to operate in society once he leaves prison who does well. So I think the key factors that I was talking about were that you need to have a safe and a secure environment at the very outset. I understand that prisons are an inherently dangerous and potentially violent place, so I say a safe and secure environment when I consider that against the background of being in a prison. But without that, there is very little that can be done. I think what you are able to build then in a prison environment between staff and prisoners is a professional relationship that enables prisoners to eventually trust the staff, and the staff to have respect for the prisoners as a human being and not just somebody who's been sent to prison and therefore has been discarded by society. And I think key to that is to undertake risk assessments with individuals to ensure that you can identify risks to their reoffending and needs that they may have, such as maybe they are poorly educated, or they have very little in the way of employment skills, or they have very little in the way of social skills, which could have all contributed to them becoming an offender. So I think it's key that you identify those needs. But once you've done that, you then have to provide interventions which will enable you to address those needs and those risks, so that through proper risk management you are reducing that risk of that person reoffending, and you're also reducing the risk of creating more victims by that offender. Clearly, people come into prison with different positions in life. Somebody could come in who's illiterate, somebody could come in who is a teacher, somebody may have come into prison straight off the streets, or may have a supportive family background and even got work to go to after they are released. So you can't treat all prisoners the same. You need to identify those needs and then address the needs as you see them. And you need to be flexible enough to be able to deliver that kind of a regime. So purposeful activity going towards addressing offending behaviour is critical. And I think one of the other key factors is to ensure that you maintain and develop family ties with the prisoner and his family. And from what I've seen actually in Armenia, you go a long way to making that a real positive relationship. But that's not to say that there are other things that could be done. And I think it's particularly important when talking about children, and very young children, who have a relative in prison, that you consider how to make them coming into prison to visit their family relative much less of a daunting and bewildering experience, and a frightening experience in some circumstances. So I think that's quite critical in moving forward. And I think another area where I think needs developing, and it's something we experienced in the UK, is that for a long time we dealt with everything to do with the prisoner. We provided healthcare, we provided education, we provided everything. But we have moved in the last 30 years in the UK to a system that actually involves and actively engages in real partnerships with other organisations, so that we can bring the best into the prisons to deliver the best for them. So an example of that would be that the healthcare is now provided by the UK's National Health Service, not by prison officers trained in healthcare. So prisoners get the same that you could get in the community in prison. Not any better, but they do get the same. We now provide education for prisoners, compulsory education for young offenders, and voluntary education for adult offenders, provided by external further education colleges, who are the experts in education. Prison Service was never an expert in education, but we have now utilised these experts, and I think there is scope for that in Armenia too. In addition, we try to provide work that can lead to legitimate employment once the prisoner is released, so they can gain real skills that they can transfer into the employment market when they are released. It's a difficult situation for an offender to leave prison even with skills and gain employment. There is natural resistance to offenders being employed, particularly if you're living in an environment where there is high unemployment. Why should we give employment to an ex-offender when there are 10 people who aren't ex-offenders who are also wanting that job? And I understand how difficult it is, which is why in the UK we've engaged with employers and tried to encourage people from the community, large employers, medium employers, and even individual employers, to come and have a look at what they can offer and what the prisoners can offer them in terms of sustaining their future in society. So metaphorically speaking, what we've tried to do is to knock down the prison walls so that the community can come in. And I think by strengthening those community links, we've gained an awful lot in terms of raising prisoners' confidence and self-esteem and a feeling that actually their life can be put back in some kind of order when they are released. And the gap between custody and community is like a huge chasm. If they're not properly supported in order to bridge that gap, they will fall down the gap. And if they fall down the gap, it leads to only one other course. They will return to offending. And I think it's an authority's responsibility not to lock people up and then ignore what it means for them to be released. Because if we put into custody somebody who has a drug addiction and they live next door to you, would you want me to release that prisoner having done nothing to address that addiction so that they come back and live a chaotic lifestyle living next door to you? Or if there is somebody who perpetrates violence on individuals, if we've done nothing in custody to help address that offending behaviour, we will be releasing that person back into your community, back to you as your next door neighbour, and you may still live in fear of that individual perpetrating violence on you. So it's incumbent upon society in general and the prison authorities in particular to ensure public protection by dealing with these issues with prisoners whilst they're in custody and dealing with them in a humane way that does provide for mutual respect. All these prisoners, bar a very few handful, will be returning to society. So we need to be able to look after them in such a way that doesn't mean that you're soft with them, because some of the things that you may want to do with prisoners to help rehabilitate them could be quite difficult for the prisoner to come to grips with and to come to terms with. But that shouldn't prevent you from doing it. The prisoner needs to confront himself or herself in these circumstances and look at what their behaviour has done and how they have created victims. So in the long run, at the end of this, you are putting better citizens back into society than you received into custody. And if you can do that with the vast majority of people that come into your care, then you have achieved what you set out to do. You've applied the court's decision, you've kept them in custody for as long as the court has authorised you to, you've worked with them whilst in custody, and you have released them subsequently, as I say, better citizens, better equipped to cope with society's ups and downs, and hopefully have maintained strong family ties, given them skills which they can transfer into the workplace, and hopefully preventing them from creating any more victims, and thereby answering the prime question of the role of the prison is to public protection.